As people dial in, what I'll do is I'll run through our slides as usual to get started. The meeting today is our North America and European meeting. It's a monthly meeting where we bring people together to discuss primary community activities. In the case of this meeting, as with all meetings in the OpenChain project and the Linux Foundation, our antitrust policy applies. You can find it on the Linux Foundation website. And if you're from one of our member companies, you can contact our counsel, Andy Updegrove, with any questions. This meeting has a regular agenda. Basically, we go through our news, we work on our standards and core material, we have a section for any other business, and then we close the meeting. When it comes to the purpose of this meeting, the overarching theme is that we align ourselves on the most important topics, and this is where we do the live editing of our existing specifications and ideas and proposals for updates or future specifications. So this is the heartbeat of the project itself. The news today is going to be relatively brief. We've got some big things coming, and I don't want to swamp us with too much noise. ISO 18974 is awaiting publication. So we expect it to be out basically in the next week or so. We are at the very cusp of, therefore, doing all the formal PR around this. Some of that will be the usual thing of just telling people the standard exists. But as with ISO 5230, our license compliance spec, our ISO standard for security is going to be announced and have adjacent conformance announcements. A major Asian bank will be announcing conformance with the security standard as soon as ISO goes live and we go live with our PR. So that's nice to go straight out there with a bank. We, of course, have companies like BlackBerry and LG Electronics already conformant with the de facto version of the security standard, but it does make a splash when the ISO version is published, and it will be great to actively demonstrate how our standards are going deeper into the financial sector. Bringing us back a few days earlier, in a couple of hours, we'll be formally announcing that Korea Telecom has adopted ISO 5230, our ISO standard for license compliance. That's a pretty big deal. It's an enormous telco in Asia, and by numbers, one of the largest in the world. So, big stuff. Our second ISO standard will be out momentarily. We have a very large bank leaning into that and announcing their adoption of the ISO standard for security on the same day. And meanwhile, momentum continues with our existing license compliance standard. That's all very nice. Well done. Now we'll move into the work part of our day. And we're going to talk about what's coming up. Okay, so this is all about context. The specification workgroup and this call has been an arena where our community has been discussing various things. The key things, the most important things, are proposals for updating our license compliance and our security assurance standards in the future. So for the last year or so, the community has been going through open issues and opening new issues to look ahead at what could be next for both of those ISO standards. With the license compliance standard, the motivation is very simple. We've been in market now for almost 4 years, and we've had plenty of feedback to put into that. For the security assurance standard, as I just said a couple of slides ago, we'll be publishing the ISO version in the next week or two. So why are we already working on an update? Well, that actually goes back to the genesis of our submission to ISO. Before we submitted to ISO, we pre-socialized with JTC Working Group Subcommittee 27. So that's information and communication technology security. And that security sub-work group is where they make lots of ISO standards for security. And we went to them and we made sure that what we had produced around open source security assurance did not contradict or conflict with anything that they had underway. And they confirmed that was the case. They had no particular concerns or issues, and they provided us with some great editorial notes. However, they also provided us with tons of notes on ideas for scope, and they were suggesting various ways we could increase scope or change scope in the future. Mostly increase scope. Things like include other ISO standards in this ISO standard, cross-referencing, expanding the coverage of this open source security assurance standard, and so on and so forth. Now, we had already cooked our security standard and prepared it, and we were going through JTC1 with a specific process called the JTC1 pass transposition process. And that's a process where you take something that is built in the industry, done in the industry, and then you transpose it into an ISO standard. So we didn't go to the ISO Committee on Security to re-edit the existing material or the submission. We went there to solicit their confirmation it wasn't contradicting anything. And we additionally benefited from loads of ideas from them about future versions of the standard. And that's why we already got working on that. And of course, other people had ideas about the future of the security standard too, and we've got a bunch of open issues. What will happen with these proposals for updates to the standards and some proposals for potential new standards is that we will take the proposals, check if they're ready, and then bring them before the steering committee of the OpenChain project in early December. The steering committee is made up of the governing board members plus the chairs of the specification work group. And the steering committee will review the material and then provide formal guidance on where to go next. So we have some thinking to do about, are the proposals far enough along, and what do we do with them? For those of you who are familiar with this call, you'll be aware that what happens next is some links. So in the chat, you're going to get the links for the current versions of the licensing and security specification. And now you'll get the links for the proposed future versions, the draft updates. The current versions are there for your reference of what is the state of the art in the market, and the future drafts are there because that's what we've got to make some decisions about. We need to decide if those drafts are ready to go before the steering committee. We need to think about, have we missed any errors? And we need to think about, do we need to close other open issues, et cetera, et cetera. I'll come back to that in a moment, but I wanted to also give you some information about the proposed contribution spec. So there it is. We'll come to the telco thing a little bit later, but the telco SBOM quality spec is in a very different stage. The contribution spec, very early days, and it's really a situation where the community has begun talking about this. The links you'll find outline the idea. Then there's the kickoff call to discuss it and a list of the issues to review. We'll swing back to that in a moment. In a very concrete sense, let's talk about what we need to do for licensing and security. So we have open issues on both the licensing and security draft specifications for the future. These open issues are probably always going to be there. I mean, we had open issues around the standard for license compliance before, during, and after its ISO grant. So we were already in a situation where we made a judgment call about what we include. What we don't, we move into a future discussion. We're back at that moment now. We need to decide, what do we do? We have very little time before the steering committee meets in early December, adjacent to our board meeting scheduled on the 6th of December in Japan. That means we have two calls, this call and one more call, to make some decisions. And those decisions are really, are the current drafts ready to go before the steering committee? And are there any urgent open issues that we should try to close before that time? So some editorial. We have to look at this material and think, are there typos or weird errors in the drafts that were consequences of the drafting process? Is there something goofy that we need to fix? And then B, are there open issues that we need to fix so that we can put this material in front of the steering committee on the 6th of December so they can formally see what we've been doing in proposing updates to the ISO standards and provide guidance on that. Okay, we'll swing back to this in a minute. Contribution, it's very, very similar. We're in a situation where we have some open issues. We have a draft document that is not at all ready. It's a very early stage proposal of doing something around contribution. And we need to assess, therefore, whether the current draft can be brought into a form that's ready to go before the steering committee in early December, or it's something that the community keeps noodling on and brings before the steering committee in Q1 2024 or later. Next steps around the SBOM quality, the telco spec, are probably less involved for us, given that this is the monthly global community call, and this is the specification work group. The telco work group was working on a proposal for an SBOM quality spec, and they basically completed it, and they were just about ready to hand it over to us for our assessment when further feedback came in, and now they're considering whether the SBOM quality proposal perhaps fits better in the SPDX project. So we're waiting for their formal decision about what they want to do next. And it does seem like whatever happens around SBOM quality, they won't have a draft specification to go before the steering committee in December unless winds dramatically change. For those who are interested, you can have a look at the mailing list and see where their discussion is at. Particularly active in the discussion, you'll find Nokia, KDDI, Ericsson, Sony, and Toshiba. Anyway, long story short, the proposal for doing something on SBOM quality is currently under revision with the originating work group, the telco work group. They're reconsidering if what they've done belongs with an SBOM project like SPDX rather than a high-level business management project like OpenChain, or it should become something else, such as a guide, etc., etc. The proposal for doing something around contribution, should there be a sister spec to our license and security specs and contribution, that proposal is still in quite early days. And the question is it progressed far along enough to be formally put before the steering committee? At this moment, the draft is placeholders mostly and open issues and ideas. So it doesn't look like that is ready at this moment in time. But this is something for the community to assess and decide. And bear in mind that it has to go before the steering committee to get guidance and any form of endorsement about actually becoming a spec as opposed to being an idea. The biggest weight we have, though, is quite simply licensing and security. We have a bunch of proposals and refinements about what can be done to update to ISO standards. And we need to decide if those are ready. And are there any urgent issues to close before they go in front of the steering committee, which will then assess the documents and decide if those updates look viable and if it is time to update the ISO standards or not. Okay, I just wanted to pause here and ask if anyone has any questions about this rather lengthy exposition around the processes and what has to be done. Okay, if there's no questions, then before we have a look at the nitty-gritty of licensing and security, I notice we've got Gary O'Neill on the call. And Gary, I just wanted to zoom over to the SBOM area. I know that there's some really exciting stuff happening around the SPDX project with, I believe, a system profile, and now there's a discussion about a business profile. We just had an export control meeting today, and we had a presentation from Matthew at ARM and Yumo at Carl Zeiss, I believe, talking about how SPDX may be including a business profile that covers things like export control and so on and so forth. So it seems like there's an awful lot going on in the SPDX project about covering a lot of ground in bills of materials. And know that that ties into where the SBOM quality spec discussion is going and why the telco group is considering heading in your direction.
Yeah, and this actually came up in the Open Source Summit Europe, but we discussed this a bit as well. And the idea, one of the ideas that we're discussing is, should we have various industry groups represented as profiles? And just to put some context of what a profile is in SPDX, it's actually three different things, all referred to as a profile. But number one is it's a conformance spec, that if you provide an SBOM and you say that you are adhering to a particular profile, you're asserting that you have the minimum properties, the minimum requirements that are specified for that profile. So in the area of telecom quality, what one of the things they've done is they've said that if you're going to have a quality SBOM for the telco industry, it needs to have these minimum requirements. So it seems to be a very natural fit for the conformance part of the profile. It's also, profiles are also what we call a namespace. It's just a way of organizing the spec. So if you want to filter and look just at the things that are interesting to you, you can filter on the profile. And it's also how we organize. That's a third thing that it is. It's how we do our work groups. So with just that as a context, what we're talking about is having industry-focused profiles. I was just on a call this morning with the FinOS group, which does financial services open source, and they had some interest in doing something similar. I think another one that hasn't been discussed yet, but has been on my mind, is perhaps even the automotive group. I know there's some requirements that have come up from that organization in terms of software expiration fields, things such as that might be of unique interest. So if you're in a particular industry and you're interested in starting something up, we can certainly start up a profile group for that industry in 3.1. And then Shane, you mentioned the business profile. The name for it is a little under debate, but basically, having compliance related profiles that go beyond licensing and security. Export, I think, is the most top of mind to folks, but there's also things like patents and that as well. I think going into patents is meeting some interesting discussions, and that in the past we've decided to focus pretty much exclusively just on licensing and not so much the patent aspects of it. But it is under discussion right now. The export, I think, is a little clearer or less debated. I think there's definitely a number of people interested. It's, by the way, the export has also come up in the software as a service profile. which is also a new profile that's going to be introduced in 3.1. That actually, the software as a service profile actually was originated from OpenChain. There was on the OpenChain email thread a suggestion that certain properties related to security of online services, be included in something like a bill of materials, a services bill of materials, if you will. So that instigated a working group that's been going on for some time now, and we've just finished our use case prioritization. So we're just deciding which ones to work on. So anyway, sorry, Shane, a very lengthy update, but a lot going on in the SPDX world.
No, no, no. It's very interesting. And Gary, this is just a side note. It's not a criticism or a concern on my end. It's just a side note that, as you know, OpenChain has uh, an export control work group, and we've very much taken a baby step into this domain. It was a case of community members said, let's have a work group and see what knowledge there is, what resources there are around export control and open source. And mostly what has happened as an outcome of that work group is that several of the people have got together and set up a little project outside of OpenChain where a large corpus of material about export control and open source that was previously maintained by a Dutch professor is being moved from HTML into Markdown, so it's easy to update and translate, and is being gradually prepared for cross checks by export control people to make sure that the material, which is about 10 years old, reflects the existing treaties and rules and so on. And the concept behind that is very much just this professor created a resource that you could quickly go to. And if you were, let's say, at an OSPO and you suddenly thought about open source and export control, how do I prep myself to go and talk with our export control team? How do I do some background? That type of resource was potentially useful, but hard to discover. So those volunteers decided, oh, let's try and bring a refreshed version of that and make it easy for non-export control people to do some prep work so they can go and talk to their export control people and not start from zero. And that's mostly what's been happening on our export control community discussion, and some other stuff as well, as people just noodled on the sheer lack of resources out there and the sheer lack of effective approaches, yet then the discovery that, for instance, certain tools are able to assist with export control, and those tools also do open source scanning. And the question of, oh, should that be included in some guides and so on, et cetera, et cetera. But very much baby steps. So today was the first time I heard about what's going on over at the SPDX project. And I was just surprised that there's a discussion, and correct me if I'm wrong, the discussion is that the business profile, name to be determined, will have fields to cover aspects of export control. And potentially that will be activated. This will be in play from SPDX 3.1, which would probably be in around 9 months. Is that correct?
Yeah, the time frame is very open right now, but I think that's in general, what we're thinking. There's a lot of new profiles that we're working on in 3.1. It seems like what's happening is we have a good foundation to describe all the parts of the software, all the dependencies, all the relationships between the dependencies. And any use case where that information is valuable is turning into a profile. So, exports, if you have a component that's impacted by export, we already have that description in the core. So adding the additional fields is nice and incremental. You don't have to reinvent the core. So I think that seems to be what the trend that's happening in 3.1 is the introduction of profiles, and having a good foundation to start with is leading to this very welcome proliferation of profiles in the spec. So it'll be that 9 months from now, I think it'll be really interesting. I think we'll see the usage of SPDX really pick up in these different domains.
And just to flag for some context for people on the call who might be newer to this field or, for instance, not part of discussions, around 8 years ago, when OpenChain started, the chair of SPAC, Mark Giese, had a vision at that time that we would start with license compliance, and then we would expand to domains like security, and then we would expand to domains like export control and so on. Now, he originally had this idea that there'd be this one monolithic specification, which would then have modular sections for all of these things. Now, as you know, uh, what has happened in OpenChain is somewhat different. We built a license compliance standard, and then we did build a security standard because there was strong market demand. But we haven't made a monolithic specification with modules. Instead, we've made sister standards, and we're opening the doors for the community to discuss potential new business process standards, but we're taking a very conservative attitude regarding how we do this. And all of that's based on market feedback. One, demand pull, where people are saying, I want something. And two, the hesitation given our well, I suppose our status as an ISO standard making project, it's our job to be extremely conservative. Anyway, 8 years ago, there was discussion already about a market gap around a topic like export control. There wasn't a clear vision of how to address it. And one way, I think, where Mark Giese was coming from, and where a lot of the original founders of OpenChain were coming from, was that business process management in that domain may be a useful approach. At that time, SPDX was about 4 years old or 5 years old, but it was very much focused on license compliance. And SBOMs were not a global thing yet. They weren't on everyone's top of mind. But of course, things changed. And in the last 3 or 4 years, SBOMs have become central to all software everywhere in the supply chain. So it's very natural that something like export control has landed in the middle of that discussion. And I was just interested at the fact that it was being noodled on to the extent that it has been, and it was very interesting. The recording of our volunteer group on export control will be going live in the next 24 hours. You can have a look and see what the SPDX people have been proposing over in their domain on software bill of materials. By the way, everyone, please do forgive me for slight incoherency. I just had my 5th COVID vaccine and I feel weird. So I'm not top of form. But anyway, this SBOM stuff is all interesting, and it ties into historical things we've talked about. It ties into community momentum. Naturally, we'll be collaborating to learn from our friends at SPDX, and we'll be on standby to lend knowledge and experience where we can be useful. This is exactly the type of thing we've done previously. That's how the SPDX light profile came to be. And it's heartening to see that our projects continue to share a lot. On our side, we're probably going to now, I suppose, brief people in the same way you've been briefed on this call. We're going to brief our board and our steering committee and get a feel for their temperature on how they want to approach these things, how they want to engage, what are the pros and cons of these market developments, et cetera, et cetera. Nothing tremendously exciting, but tremendously important to socialize what's happening and get people's feedback and see where they think the market needs to evolve. Obviously, OpenChain and SPDX are two projects that have market influence in different ways. So we're in a fortunate position of the ability to make change, but also an interesting position of course, extreme responsibility and caution. So no doubt there'll be plenty of discussion as we noodle on all of these topics. But back to today. Okay, the practical side. Licensing and security. We have to decide if we're going to put the drafts in front of the steering committee. And to be more accurate, we have to decide, are the current drafts okay, or are they a bit broken? And just putting the links back in, these are the current drafts. And I would so deeply appreciate if people could take a look at them and just find weird errors. You know, is there a logic problem? Is there a spelling problem? The kind of stuff that happens because a community has been editing something on GitHub and making a proposal. We've got 4 weeks to polish it, and then it goes through the steering committee, and they'll have a look at it, and they'll provide guidance. Obviously, their feedback and guidance will be most useful if those drafts are in the best possible form. But equally important, we do have to think about not just polishing the drafts, but are there open issues that we really need to close? And for those of you who haven't been on calls in the last couple of weeks, we've had some tremendous work done where we have had issues closed on one spec that then led to alignment and improvements to the other spec. And basically, I think we've had a positive feedback loop that has got these draft proposals potentially offering, I would say, cautious evolutionary improvements to making it easier to read and translate the standards and understand the standards so you can get your business processes done faster. But obviously, if we have an open issue that is red hot and needs to cover one or other specs, then we should work on that. And I mentioned the ISO subcommittee 27. So JTC1 Working Group Subcommittee 27, ICT Security. They provided a bunch of items around our security spec. We've closed a bunch of their suggestions. A lot of their scope stuff that came from individual contributors, we didn't put in, okay, because our spec is open source security assurance focused on known vulnerabilities. And there were various suggestions coming in that would have widened the scope a lot. And we weren't ready to go there. We don't want to take big steps where we can take small steps. And we didn't do things like add other ISO standards as requirements into our spec, for the simple reason that if we started stacking standards as requirements, then it becomes a huge burden to use our specs. And our approach for the last 8 years has been, rather than stacking standards as requirements, to describe how standards can be stacked, to reference standards, and then let people make their own determinations, which fits into the model and the responsibility we have as an ISO standard making project. We talk about what, not how. Okie dokie. So that's the big picture of where we're at. And I just wanted to check if anyone has any comments or questions about that situation, particularly, if you've got any questions about what the steering committee is likely to do or how that works. I'm very happy to clarify.
Then up to when do you need the feedback for this?
Well, the last possible moment would be end of day Japan time, December 5th. But honestly, I would love us to have this done on the last day of November, and then have a couple of days lead time before I bring it to the steering committee. So what'll happen is we'll have a board meeting on the morning of 6th of December here in Japan. So that's going to be the evening, very late evening for you, Andreas, in Germany, and it's going to be the afternoon of the 5th in the US. And the board meeting will probably run for an hour and a half, and then there'll be half an hour where the steering committee will look at the specs, or they might take an hour, who knows. And what will happen is then, formally speaking, the project will look at what the community is suggesting, and the project leadership will then provide guidance. So our last year of work has been the community noodling community ideas. And that provides tremendous freedom for everyone to turn up on these calls, on GitHub, on our mailing lists, and throw in ideas. The steering committee is the gateway where the project formally assesses the ideas and provides guidance. Maybe they'll say, oh, we love it. We're going to update the standards. And here's a suggested timescale. They might say, well, some ideas are great, some are not. They might say, at the moment, we're not going to update the standards, but keep the noodling process going and keep refining for future updates. All of these things are on the table, and a lot of it depends, I think, on how the updates positively improve trust in the supply chain without adding a burden or confusion to it. So it's going to be a nuanced discussion, and not just about the mechanics of the spec, but about the politics of supply chain procurement, timescales, reliability, et cetera, et cetera. And when we show them the drafts, we also have the option of providing rationales and so on and so forth, so that they can better understand community thinking. So for example, perhaps Chris, who's on this call, and Helio, the two co-chairs of SPEC, may or may not have an interest in working on some information to go before the steering committee as a rationale about how and why we should do this update and what type of timescales might be appropriate, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, we have exactly 1 month to get that stuff done and to make decisions. I'll be reaching out offline to Helio and Chris to discuss their strategies. And we'll also be, of course, discussing on our mailing list, and we'll be using the recording of this call to provide guidance to people on that as well. I hope that explains things.
Yeah, and how shall we comment? Shall we open a ticket or?
Tickets would be brilliant. They'd be brilliant. So if you are comfortable with it, opening tickets on GitHub is ideal, because that makes it easy for us to, really easy for us to track what happened and how we resolved it. But you can do it just by commenting on this call. You can send an email to the specification mailing list, all of those options. The most convenient administratively is open a ticket on GitHub, but you don't have to do that.
Okay, thanks.
You're super welcome. If there's no immediate comment on this, and if you're mulling over it, I just wanted to turn to the contribution proposal, which is not ready yet. But I just wanted to bring this up because I notice we've got some people on the call that have been part of the early part of the discussion. So I see Mary Matrin from Continental is here. Hi, Mary. And I know that you've commented about the draft not being ready, about it being too focused on aspects that are linked to compliance because the early draft was a fork. And I just wanted to touch base with you because you flagged that companies like Continental are working on contribution process management. And I wanted to touch base with you and just see if that's still the case, if you're still interested in being part of this discussion and so on.
Yeah, I'm interested in being part of it. We are still working on our contribution process, but I'm more interested in it being not exactly the same as the regular OpenChain, the main OpenChain spec.
Mm-hmm.
So like, how is it different? Because if this is a spin-off process, that's what I'm kind of looking for, is what else do we need to do for contribution
Right.
besides regular OpenChain?
Absolutely. And you were one of several people that mentioned an interest in contribution process management. So at this stage, it sounds like some of the drivers behind this, for instance, Jimmy Alberg proposed this originally. Maybe next steps would include a brief survey of people with interest in contribution to see what type of process gaps they're trying to address and where this could be scoped as a proposal. Because right now it's got some scoping. I'm just going to open that little draft. It's got some scoping. Okay. Okay. I'm trying to find the material clearly. Okay, I'm not having much success in finding the exact point I wanted to find, but there is some scoping about how a program could be run for aspects of contribution, but there's a lot of placeholder material which came from the other specs, which probably needs to be ripped out and so on and so forth. So it's really early days, and it sounds like while people are interested in, let's say, outbound IP management and going beyond what we've already said in the license compliance spec, which is have a policy. Okay, people are saying, okay, a policy plus what? And there's an interest in digging out that a bit, but we probably need to tighten up the discussion further.
Yeah. When does this group usually meet? Because I think it's not on my calendar.
Okay.
That could be the time zone.
Absolutely. So what I want to do is flag that the main way I'd encourage your calendar to be updated, and I'm just putting the link. Oh, sorry, that's the wrong link. It didn't copy paste what I wanted. The main way I'd encourage your calendar to be updated is to go to the link I just put in, OpenChain Participate, and that will show you our global calendar with the meetings, and it's got instructions to add it to your Outlook or your Google, so that you'll continually be updated on the meeting times. And what you're looking for are the monthly community calls. You'll find one today, timed for North America and Europe, and then you'll find one in the middle of the month, timed for North America and Asia.
Yeah, I'm looking for the contribution.
Okay.
Discussion about contribution.
All of the discussion will happen on the monthly calls from now on. The only part of contribution that was unique was the kickoff call. And the kickoff call in September resulted in deciding to have all discussion on the monthly calls so that we unify all of the proposals for updates to specs or proposed new specs in one space. So you don't have to go to other calls.
Okay, so I'll take a look at that, and then I'm also probably going to pull in a colleague or two to help with this. Somebody who's more directly involved with our contribution process development.
Okie dokie. And, you know, this is very much a proposal in the early days. There's some issues open where people are thinking about things, and the thinking would need to be narrowed considerably before this proposal begins to tighten up into what would be a viable specification to go before the steering committee to see if they like it or not, want it or not, or it belongs elsewhere or not, et cetera, et cetera. So quite a lot of work to do there. But Mary, thank you very much. It's very useful to touch base on this. And, you know, we have interest in it, so we have to decide what to do with that interest and energy and how to appropriately respond to our community requirements.
Right.
Okay. Now going back to our core, and our core is and remains and always will be the stuff that is positioned and approved by the steering committee and approved by the board, which would happen to be our licensing and security standards. And what we need to do there, the housekeeping, closing issues, it's a to-do task. It's not something I plan to do on this call because people will have to look at things and think about it. And what I'll suggest is that we do that offline. We do that on the mailing list. We do that in preparation for the next call in 2 weeks. With that note, I'll just pause and see if anyone has any questions or comments about the specs. Okay, if there's no questions or comments, I'll make a note and this is moving towards any other business, that there's lots of other parts of the OpenChain project around the world. And our global education work group has been very busy. They have been updating our training slides, and they've been updating our supplier education leaflets, and they've been updating onboarding material. Some of this is in preparation for our ISO release on the security standard, and some of it is more generally housekeeping. But they're doing a lot of work, and it's very cool. And I highly recommend you take a look at our global calendar. Their next meeting is going to be on November 9th, and that's at 5 p.m. UTC. So that's going to be the morning in the US. It's going to be the afternoon in Europe. And I think joining that call, connecting with Nathan might be really useful to see how core material relating to our license and security standards, our training material is being developed over there. I mentioned that our export control work group was a talking space, and that people from there had gone off and set up new projects and so on. You can find that and other groups on this calendar. What I would flag of extreme interest, I think, is the automation work group, talking about tooling and so on and so forth. It had a tremendous October led by Marcel from Bosch. And now Francis from Siemens Healthineers is chairing in November. They're covering a lot of ground about automation to help with our business process management challenges. This is very different from our standards, just as the education work is different from our standards. The standards are the what, and then education explains options for how. Automation looks at options for how in the tooling world. Highly recommended. And this brings us back into the, I suppose, the PDX wheelhouse, in that, you know, things are happening around tooling. The SPDX tools, for instance, have been updated recently. We've had platforms such as Fossilite in Asia, or open source reviewed toolkit, or improving in Europe. And those things are making significant changes in how the supply chain can work. So highly recommended, and it's right there in the global calendar. Apart from that, what we do now is we give a space where I ask, do you have any other business you want to bring to the table and discuss in this meeting? All right. If you don't, then I have one, I suppose, final item I wanted to show you very briefly. If I could pull it up, find it in the corner. I'm just going to move back to our slide while I attempt to find the thing I really wanted to find. Yes. I'm going to show you an image, which I think is an indicator of how these long calls and all this work is tying together to make real change. And the indicator I wanted to show you is related to our market progress. Okay, so our market progress has been significant. In this year, we have made some big changes to how things work around the world. And to give you an idea of the type of changes, these are our slides. Every month we release slides in GitHub showing our progress. And our changes this year, for instance, on our website, companies asking to be listed as conformant have increased by 20%. We've had an 85% increase in certifiers certifying our ISO standards, 20% increase in service providers, 18% in vendors, 14 in legal providers. Now we've doubled our standards maintained, and we've got a 200% increase specification ideas. In other words, there's a lot of forward momentum here. But the biggest data point that I want to bring you is that some of our partners are doing market surveys, and PwC just finished some research that shows now 31% of large German companies that they surveyed are using who's planning to use ISO 5230. So that's up from 20% 2 years ago. That's the type of impact we're having. I'm discussing with Deloitte about doing another global survey with them to dig further into different geographies. Tremendous work, everyone. Real market impact there. And I think that's why so many ideas are landing on our table. So many cool things. People are having suggestions. People are opening discussions. It's because there's so much momentum. A quiet
Hey,
note.
Shane.
Yeah, go ahead. Hey, Chris.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you had a real status on the security assurance specifications progress. I heard you talking about it earlier, but
Yep.
I wasn't sure if they were releasing it tomorrow or next month or.
So, okay, what I have is some feedback that maybe the 13th of November, but maybe is all I've got.
Okay,
So that'll
so
give us
it's
a week.
still nebulous.
Yeah, it's scheduled. It will be happening this month. Okay, so it's announced as publication in November. And the only question is which day. And the maybe day I got was 13, which would be in, well, 5 days. But let's see,
Yeah.
because you know how it is with ISO. Sometimes things are a bit slower.
Yeah, I know.
We are explicitly under publication this month. The only question is the day. And naturally, that means I'm juggling a lot of plates because we'll want to do tremendous PR, but I won't know we're published until I see it on the website or get a ping from the ISO team to say it's out.
Is that in work group 27?
No, we're going through the JTC1 pass transposition process. So
Okay.
we worked with 27 just to show them the spec ahead of time, make sure that everything was nice and tidy. So that's how we socialized it, and that's how we ensured that what we were doing wasn't going sideways or representing low quality compared to expectations in this domain.
Right.
Rather the opposite. We had some positive editorial, and then of course we had a ton of scope suggestions and ideas. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm a voting member in 27, and I was looking for it and I couldn't find it.
Yeah.
So it back in JT1.
Correct.
Okay.
The working group doesn't vote on it because we're not developing it through it. We're coming in with the completed industry standard.
Right.
And then it's just transposed into an ISO standard. But as a courtesy, we did want to bring it to the working group and make sure that people had a chance to comment.
Yeah, it was when it was in the DIS phase.
Yep, correct.
Okay.
Yeah. And,
very cool.
Goodness knows the working group is busy. They reference a lot of standards that they're currently producing or updating. So,
Work group 27.
Yeah.
Yeah, I focused just down on the cybersecurity technologies part of it, because there's just way too much stuff going on in there.
I think one thing I'd love to highlight is that OpenChain project has benefited tremendously, not just from our mentors at JTC1 and of course our friends at Joint Development Foundation, but we've had an incredibly warm response from places like Working Group 27, positively assisting us and providing support and feedback. The country teams in ISO who voted on our past transposition have always been tremendously helpful. This time with the security spec, we had a ton of useful editorial and ideas from the Japanese team, by way of example. And we've had not just the formal, here's our document draft, we're going to vote on it, blah, blah, blah. We've had informal discussions with BSI in the UK, DIN in Germany, And it's just been tremendous how positive people have been about our project. So we've been very fortunate to build friendships around it.
Yep, they're a good group of people
They certainly are.
around the world.
It's remarkable. And the time people put in to do things like the Japanese editorial was way above and beyond the voting process. It was just trying to provide ideas and suggestions, and sometimes just purely notes, which was very, very useful and feeds back into our maturity as well. Right.
Thank you.
No, most welcome. And thank you very much indeed, Chris. Thank you to everyone on this call. My apologies, it's been something of a monologue because we're at this critical moment where we're dealing with a lot of community activity, but we also are going to some formal processes for review and guidance. It's very important to make sure everyone knows where we're at and why. I appreciate your time. I wish you to have a beautiful day, and I look forward to seeing you or talking to you very soon. Take care.
Thanks, Shane.
Thanks, Shane. Good
Bye-bye.
evening. Bye-bye.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.